Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. I'm your host, Luqmaan Shadrach. Thanks for joining us. It's Thursday, means that it's our legal series that we continue, and tonight's topic is in community of property. And joining us back in studio, attorney Brother Whalied Said. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you and all the viewers out there.
Jazakallah so much for coming into studio over the last couple of weeks. We've chatted about various matrimonial regimes, or property regimes, with the South African law context as well.
Yes.
Today, we've decided to discuss in community of property. So let's start with that. Why is the topic of in community of property regime viewed as sometimes problematic by many ulama in the context of Sharia law, and how we view it as the Muslim community?
Okay, so by default, in community means that you share everything, right? When you get married to someone in community of property, you are entitled to half the assets, but are also liable for half of the liabilities, and that obviously goes both ways for husband and wife. Right. In terms of Sharia law, a woman's assets belongs to her.
Okay.
And obviously you can share between yourself, your husband and wife can share between themselves what they agree upon.
Okay.
And in short, right? So when one looks at community of property versus Sharia law, you have a situation where instead of the wife retaining her asset, she now gives off half of her assets to her husband, assuming she has assets going into the marriage.
Right.
And that is where one of the problems come in. But the second problem, of course, comes in where you're dealing with inheritance. Now, when you pass away, the distribution of inheritance is determined by the Quran. Most of it is determined in the Quran, right? But when you're involved in a matrimonial property regime that is in community of property, it conflicts with that which is in the Quran in terms of when I die, my spouse automatically gets half of my estate, as opposed to 1/8 in the case of a wife or 25% in the case of a husband, right? So there's a direct conflict with the Quran in that respect as well. So that is in essence where the biggest conflict comes in from the Sharia perspective.
Okay. Gotcha. Lovely explanation. And I think that clarifies the topic and just gives a bit more perspective into, the in community of property scenario. But if you look at visual examples, like, people tend to often pool their assets together in a marriage, like you said, and liabilities as well. Maybe help couples understand the implications of the marital regime. Maybe more importantly, explain what the repercussions or pros and cons of that can be.
Okay. So if you, not that you should, but if you take Sharia law and put it aside for a moment and you don't consider that at all. So let's say we're speaking to a non-Muslim audience and we're not considering Sharia law, then the obvious benefit, and this is what they push by default, is that you look at the customary marital situation, which nowadays almost doesn't exist anymore, where the woman stays at home and the husband goes out and work, right? So now what happens is 10, 20 years later, there's a divorce and the woman has absolutely nothing and the husband walks away with everything. Right? So community of property is supposed to solve that problem, whereby the woman now gets half of whatever the husband's built up over the duration of their marriage, and vice versa. We've had scenarios where you had a house husband and the woman was working in corporate or whatever. So it applies both ways, right? So that is supposed to be the benefit, where you don't leave someone by the wayside in terms of just because you were looked after the matrimonial home and you looked after the kids, that you don't not benefit. All right. So what's also happened now is that, and we chatted about this in one of the previous episodes, is the recent amendments to the Divorce Act, which came into effect, I think, in May this year.
That's correct.
And that also makes provision for situations where a woman was married. It mostly applies, obviously, to the woman where a woman was married, even if it was out of community of property, but she stayed at home and she contributed to the house that allowed her husband to work. then she would be entitled, if she proves that contribution, to some form of compensation for the contribution that she made.
Right.
But in essence, the whole concept of community of property is to support that theory and to support the person staying at home in terms of them not losing out on, let's call it life, right?
Gotcha.
Obviously, from a Muslim perspective, that doesn't apply in terms of Sharia law, right? Where it becomes problematic as well, whether it's Sharia law or not Sharia law, is when you're entering into that marriage, or I'll give you two scenarios, right?
Okay.
The first is where you're dealing with people that operate a business.
Right.
Whether it's the husband or the wife, it's irrelevant. If you're running a business, and a lot of business contracts, for example, require a director to sign surety on that contract. So if there's a problem with a business and you've signed surety and you are married in community of property, that creditor can come and take your personal assets, including your wife's assets, the car, everything. And that's the end of it. You've got no say in it, even though you as a wife, for example, stayed at home, looked after the kids, and the husband was running the business, or vice versa. The creditor can still come and take all your assets because that person signed a surety. If, however, you were married out of community of property, that wouldn't apply because your wife's estate and personal assets is completely separate from yours.
Gotcha.
So if you sign surety, then it's only your personal assets that get attached.
Can you enter into contract after the marriage has happened in terms of antenuptial, or it has to be done prior?
Ideally, it has to be done prior.
Okay.
Right? There's a massive cost implication for doing it afterward.
Okay.
Right, and we'll come to that again. But it is possible. It's called a post-nuptial contract.
Gotcha.
But it's not as simple as doing an antenuptial contract prior to your marriage.
Okay.
Right. Business was so that was the first one. The second example that I want to give is when you're coming into a marriage. So let's say one or both of these spouses were previously married or widowed. Right. So now you already have assets.
Right.
The wife already has a house, or the husband already has a house. When you're coming into that marriage and you're getting married in community of property, that husband becomes entitled to half the wife's house, and the wife becomes entitled to half the husband's house. Now, if you've got kids from a previous marriage, you might want to protect them from that.
Of course.
Because whatever you've done over the past 10, 20, 30 years, you've built up something. You've maybe worked hard to provide something for your kids. Now you get married, and suddenly that new person who's no blood relative to your kids becomes entitled to half of your assets.
Sure. Yeah. So the protection is definitely needed in entering into a marriage like this. And obviously we give an advice because for the protection and the safety of the family.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So if you look at, let's look at, you mentioned personal debt. That's one thing that caught my ear as well. How does one spouse's personal debt become the other's responsibility, especially under today's topic, which is in community of property?
So never mind any debt that you come into the marriage with. So if you're going into a marriage and let's say I've got a car, that's debt. All right, so I owe 100,000 Rand on my car. When I go into that marriage and I'm getting married in community of property, not only does my spouse become entitled to half of my asset or half of my car, they also become responsible for half of the liability.
Yeah.
Now, again, and I joked about this in our first episode, when people get married, they are so in love, they only see what they want to see. Right? So you see the asset or you see the fancy car, but you don't see the liability attached to that asset. And that can become a problem further down the line, because now COVID hits, for example, and now we're speaking practical, everybody can relate to that. And suddenly you lose your job, you lose this, and you can't pay for your car. The bank is not going to say, oh, sorry, it's COVID, never mind the debt. They want their debt. Yeah. They want their money.
And drawing up a contract prior to getting married with accrual or without accrual, it doesn't mean you care less for the person. It's just your protection of assets.
Absolutely not.
It can become a bit of an emotional thing.
You can actually look at it from a completely different perspective, because you can say, I care about you, and that's why I want to do this and protect you from any negativity or any future problems.
I got you. All right, we're going to continue after the break. We're chatting to attorney Whalied Said around in community of property. That's our legal series for today. Do join us after the break. Thanks for watching us on Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our legal series on a Thursday afternoon. I'm your host, Luqmaan Shadrach, and in studio we have attorney Whalied Said chatting to us about in community of property. That's today's topic. And remember, if you have any inquiries, you're welcome to email me, luqmaan@hilaal.tv, and we'll forward those questions and queries to Brother Whalied and his team. Jazakallah once again, Brother Whalied, for coming into studio, giving us valuable information. Before the break, we chatted about the various pros and cons with regards to getting married in community of property. And one of the things you mentioned was about, consolidation of the debt. But what are some of the examples of reckless financial decisions that could harm both partners in the in community of property regime?
Okay, maybe two simple examples there. And there is, of course, many.
Sure.
All right. So one of the things that can happen, and that probably happens most often, is business.
Mm-hmm.
So I get this fantastic idea to start a business. I go to the bank and I borrow 500,000 Rand, but I didn't think the business through properly. I was just so excited about, I'm going to have my own business and I'm going to be rich and this and that. And you set up your business, you sign a lease agreement, and 6 months down the line, things don't work out. I mean, the stats for new businesses in South Africa and worldwide, for that matter, is absolutely horrific.
And you mentioned, things like the onset of COVID that had a ripple effect. People are still recovering from the COVID loss.
So something like that, I mean, that's not even reckless, unless you've obviously done a proper due diligence and you've done all your homework and you did all of those things. But a lot of people don't do that, and that is why there's such a high failure rate for new businesses, right?
Gotcha.
So something like that, with all the good intentions that it come with, can drastically affect your financial situation. Because if that business goes down, and now you owe your landlord 300,000 Rand in unpaid rental, and you owe the bank in unpaid loans a couple of 100,000, they're going to come after your personal assets. And if you are married in community of property, that includes your wife's assets, whether it's a car or a house, or your husband's, if the woman was the business person. So that is the drastic effect that it can have. Looking at something a bit more reckless, which unfortunately also happens far too often, is a simple issue as gambling.
That often comes.
You make some money, and it's not something that is foreign to even the Muslim community.
Sure.
It happens. Even something more simpler, everyone is looking for that quick fix, that quick buck, So now you see, I see a TikTok, Bitcoin has gone up by 300%, and I'll just take my salary or this month's profits and I'll buy 500,000 Rands worth of Bitcoin, but then it suddenly tanks and the money's gone. Very risky investments if you don't know what you're doing and you haven't been watching the markets for the last year. Those things happen on a regular basis. Or you put it into an app and suddenly the money's gone because the guy stole it. And that happens all the time as well. I mean, I've had clients that have borrowed money to put into investments of that nature. And, they pay you 2 or 3 profit shares and then they're gone.
Sure.
So
be careful of those.
Be careful, yeah.
I think good advice. Thanks very much. So if you look at under Sharia principles, right? And we saw the slides flash a bit on the screen as well. A woman's assets and incomes are solely hers, right? However, does this conflict with the in-community of property regime?
So as we said earlier before the break, when you get married in community of property, it completely disregards Sharia principles. So where a woman would have owned her own asset and had her own income or her own pension fund from a job, suddenly the husband becomes entitled to half of all of those things. And that's a clear conflict in terms of Sharia. Right? I mean, there's not even 2 questions about it.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think it's plain and simple stated there as well. So let's look at a prime example, right? What happens to a couple's joint estate during a divorce? I mean, how the assets and liabilities divide? Is there a specific formula for this?
The simple formula is 50-50, right? Obviously, from a practical perspective, it's not that simple.
For sure.
Right? Because now you've got a property, you can't cut the property in half, right? So either one party must buy out the other party, or the property must be sold and the proceeds split evenly, right? But with most couples, when you're looking at a property, there's typically a bond attached to that property. So the value that you get out from that property is generally not enough for you to go and buy another house straight off. And now you're also on your own, so you might not necessarily even qualify for a bond on your own.
Correct, yeah.
Right, because it's split half. So even if you went into that marriage owning that property yourself, now suddenly you've got to give your spouse that you're divorcing half of your property. Even if their name's not on the title deed, the mere fact that you got married in community of property, that split has to take place. Not only just on property, when your pension fund, for example, the pension fund that you have with your employer, your spouse becomes entitled to 50% of your pension fund. That's vice versa, right? And what happens in divorce proceedings is the court makes an order that the husband is entitled to half of the wife's pension, the wife is entitled to half of the husband's pension. We've had cases where, for example, the husband or the wife retired or resigned, and they took out their pension, had a nice party, and now they get divorced, and then there's no pension to share because they've already spent it.
What happens in that instance? There's nothing.
There's nothing you can do. It's gone. Wow. It's water under the bridge.
Sure. Exactly. So we spoke about death. Now let's speak about death, in terms of should death occur within a marriage as well. How does the joint estate get divided? I mean, why? And in this, example, and maybe we should bring in having a will is so vital as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple of issues there, right? So how the estate gets divided is obviously dependent on what's in your will, on the one hand, right? On the other hand, it is also affected by your matrimonial property regime. So if you are married in community of property, even if your will says my estate must be divided in terms of Sharia law, right? In terms of South African law, which obviously overrides Sharia law in this country, your spouse must first get half of your estate. Now already that's non-Sharia compliant. Right? So half is first given to the surviving spouse, and then the Sharia proportions are applied. Right? And that's where the big problem comes in.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're chatting to Brother Whalied Said on our legal series. And remember, if you have any questions, queries, you're welcome to send me an email, luqmaan@hilaal.tv. Now we'll forward those questions to Brother Whalied. Now, we're talking about all of this, but it all boils down to proper planning. Whether you prior to the marriage, during the marriage, depends on divorce, on death as well. Let's chat about the division of joint estate. This could lead to serious financial or legal complications for the surviving family members if there isn't proper planning made. This can be rather tricky because, you may think that the person that passed away wanted to do something with a particular asset, but it could be something very different. How do we prevent this?
Well, I think you've kind of answered that already by saying proper planning.
Right.
Part of that planning is having a proper will in place.
Right.
Another part of that planning is being open and having proper discussions with your family or your children, and saying, listen, this is my will. I'm leaving. Well, it must be done in terms of Sharia, but I would like, for example, son number 1 to have my car and son number 2 to have my jewelry, or my daughter to have my jewelry. They have equal value or proportional value, so there's no big issue there.
Right.
But it's a question of discussion, right? And even if that wasn't had, it's also a question of understanding for those that survive the deceased.
Yeah.
It's a question of understanding that there are Sharia principles in place to guide us and to protect us. I mean, those principles aren't there to make our lives difficult. Right. And a lot of people don't understand that. So they end up fighting over, or they start weighing up, well, if we do it in community, then in South African law, then I'm going to get 50 Rand. But if you do it in terms of Sharia law, I'm going to get 45 Rand or 40 Rand. So I'd rather go that way. And that's where the fighting starts. Obviously, now I'm talking about in a case where there's no will, right? So it's tricky. And to avoid all of those types of fighting and how the estate must be wound up when I'm deceased, it's so critical to have a will. And I mean, we've spoken about this many times, not just in this series, in the previous Wills Week series that we had as well.
Absolutely. Brother Whalied, Jazakallah so much. That's the end of our time. We know we've got so much more to talk about, and inshallah we'll unpack that as we go along in the series. Wish you a lovely evening.
Shukran, same to you. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And that's how we end tonight's legal series with attorney Whalied Said. From the Cape Town team, Sohail Barnes, Mohammed Parker, and from myself, Luqmaan Shadrach. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.